I started being asked questions that I hadn't really been prepared to deal with.
Okay.
And that kind of led me down this road of like, well, how do I think biblically about the demonic? So many people get laser focused on this issue with inhabitation. And it's like, I get that. But at the same time, let's remember the whole scope and remember that flesh, world, devil. And then if we're thinking about exorcism, that's only the section we're thinking of the section of the devil, and we're speaking of one section of the
Mhm.
work of the demonic, a root issue that our demonology is often more cultural than it is biblical, regardless of where
Mhm.
we're from.
I'm Paul Van Allen. Today I'm interviewing Scott MacDonald. Scott is an author of a book called Demonology and the Global Church. He's an expert in the area of demons and Satan. He studied in Africa. He lives in Canada, where he's a professor, and he's going to go with me into the text of the scriptures. Buckle up and enjoy this interview.
I started being asked questions that I hadn't really been prepared to deal with.
Okay.
And that kind of led me down this road of like, well, how do I think biblically about the demonic? How do I biblically then attempt to resist demonic works amongst us? And so I began to study a lot more and realized that, you know what, I'm just going to move into a master's program for this. And one of the best places it seemed to kind of pursue higher education for it was in South Africa.
Mhm.
And so I went through the University of Stellenbosch for my master's there, had a professor there that was just eager to have me. He said, I sent in a proposal. He's like, this reminds me of screw tape letters. Come on down.
Mhm.
Even the university context in South Africa really has to respect the experience of the local cultures.
So they're just starting with a different preset worldview in Africa. And that's the globalization of the church is
Yes.
forcing conversations that have sort of been allowed to stay in silos for, a while, like an undisrupted Western view of the spiritual world, basically.
Well, and as we're entering into a more obviously the church has always been multicultural to an extent, but as we enter into a more multicultural church age, whether it be in our churches or even in our other Christian communities and parachurch ministries, this is precisely one of the areas where you'll find substantial disagreement. And it's usually stemming from a root issue that our demonology is often more cultural than it is biblical, regardless of where
Mhm.
we're from.
And I would love to just hear, what are some key verses for you when you take this topic on and you have kind of one shot with the congregation?
Really, my starting place is kind of ensuring that people understand the scope properly of the
Mhm.
conflict. And so I start in James 4. I find James 4 being the best place to start. It's very practically oriented. It's already like he's gone through some very basic stuff of like, hey, you need to love your neighbors, you need to love people in the church, even if they're not rich,
Yep.
you know?
Yep. Yep.
And then you get to here and you're seeing that this early church, this young church is just, James the Just, because this was written not by James, son of Zebedee. He gets martyred quite early in church history. This is James the Just, half brother of Jesus. And you can see that he's identifying that there's a lot of just basic infighting. And I
Mhm.
mean, times haven't changed too much. And
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
so he's going through exactly, well, what does that look like? Well, in verses 1 through 3 here, you see that he introduces this idea of like, there's desires at play here, there's passions.
Yeah. I'm gonna highlight some.
Um, yeah.
Yep.
And so you see that come up there.
Yep.
And what's great is you come down and you see that that's at the core of some of this quarrel, but it always brings back to mind the old quote by Moody where he talks about the greatest enemy that he's ever found was him.
Yeah. Right. Right. Right.
And he's like, we have passions to destroy, and
Yeah.
it's like, and this is exactly the case. And this is a nice counterbalance to what we see in some parts of the world where, if there's division in a local church, people are talking about the spirit of Jezebel or something.
Hmm.
That seems like a recent conversation.
Hmm.
And
Yeah. 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 Right. Absolutely.
yeah, sure, a few of your viewers know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, no, there's something to be said about being able to identify the the self as root. Okay. We
Yeah.
like to think that, deception and quarrels around us are because of, you know, either demons or just, world systems around us. We're just a victim of everything around us. But the reality is that when it comes to why do I exist in a world filled with deception and evil, it's because of me.
Like
And I
basically
think
the world, the flesh, and the devil are not three separate buckets. And
well, we're going to see them all interplay in this
yeah,
text because you
yeah,
get down to
right,
verse 4 and he literally says, well, when you are acting in these desires, you are just being a friend of the world. And that, of course, is coming from cosmos,
right.
which shouldn't be thought of as literally a globe. It's meaning the world system, the global fallen evil world system.
Hmm.
And that's what we do. I mean, we do that all the time. I mean, some cultures, um, one culture I was involved in, I've spent a lot of time in. There is a very strong culture of loaning out money, okay,
Right,
to extended family members, okay, but there is not a very strong culture of repaying those debts.
right.
And so what you see in that culture is there's so much lingering bitterness underneath the surface because people have continued to follow their desires, feed into this cultural system, and it's created this, this again, they're not separate silos. The
Right. Yeah.
the idea of like worlds, a fallen world system and our fleshly desires, they're just completely mixed together and we're feeding into those systems. Yeah, and I even think about like the things that we click on, the
Yes.
videos we swipe past. Like we are with each one of those things, we're ascribing value to something and we are feeding into the world system or we're fighting the world system.
Absolutely. And that sort of alertness, that First Peter 5 calls us to being devoured. It's like, man, talk about not being alert. Like we
Yeah.
go into sort of like veg mode as we're going through TikTok and YouTube shorts or whatever. And
Yep.
that liking and we're
Mhm.
being bombarded with
Yep.
images and ideas and value statements. And, just thinking of, I think it's Psalm 101 where David says, I will, not look with approval on anything that is vile, but
Yep.
it's like, boy, once you do look with approval on something that is vile, I mean, you're really on a James 4 path. You've
Mhm.
sort of, but it's like when that stuff is coming at you in a way that a first century person would not have even been able to conceive of.
And you see here that in verse 7, he brings us
Yeah.
and he roots all of this in the greater spiritual rebellion.
Hmm.
That there is really a sense in which who do we belong to? Submit yourselves then to God,
Hmm.
resist the devil. And I talk with my students all the time. I always talk about, you have your blood family, whether you like it or not, whether you know them or not, maybe you were
Yeah.
adopted. But in a similar way, you also have a spiritual family, whether you know it or not. There's
Right.
only two spiritual families in the world. You're either children of the devil or you're sons of God.
Yep.
And so,
Well, it
yeah,
makes
and you
me think
see
of
that
another.
kind of dichotomy here.
I want to pull on some threads here, but it makes me think of one of the passages that um, I pulled out of your book into my memories, package on spiritual warfare is, and again,
Yeah.
another unexpected verse. I think it's Second Corinthians 2, where he
Mm,
says, I have forgiven in the face of Christ for your sake, because we're not
mhm.
unaware of the devil's schemes.
Yes.
I think one of the things by doing a systematic look at things like what is the devil doing, what is he
Mhm.
against? It
Yep.
helps to frame, oh yeah, we're talking about a lot bigger thing here than somebody who's like eyes are rolling back in their head and they're like
Yes.
thrashing around on the ground, you know?
And that's where it's really important to go through this overview whenever I talk with people about spiritual warfare, is that I'll so many people get laser focused on this issue with inhabitation. And it's like, I get that. But at the same time, let's remember the whole scope and remember that, flesh, world, devil. And then if we're thinking about exorcism, that's only the section we're thinking of the section of the devil, and we're speaking of one section of the
Mhm.
work of the demonic. Like I'm sure you saw my book, I go through 10 different activities of the demonic.
Right.
And it's like, we need to make sure that we've got the other nine understood as well as in habitation.
Right. Yeah, I love that. So here in verse 17 of chapter
Hmm.
3, the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure and peace loving, considerate, submissive. But above here he says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show by their good life, all this stuff. But if you have bitter envy, selfish ambition in your heart, don't boast.
Yeah.
Such wisdom does not come from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic."
Yes.
So how do we tie this back to Genesis chapter 3 and what
Okay.
we see Satan doing, and what can we
Yeah.
learn from that? The verse that just really grabbed me when I was reading your book, John 8:44, where it says, you belong to your father, the devil, and he was a murderer from the beginning,
Yes.
not holding to the truth. And I thought,
Yes.
okay, that's really interesting that, okay, from the beginning, well, you can't help but think, let's go back to the beginning.
Correct.
Of course, and you point out in Genesis 3, it doesn't say the devil, but like those dots are
Yeah.
well connected by the time you're done reading
Mhm.
Revelation. So,
Correct.
and in church history and all of that. So, assuming that that's the devil in Genesis 3, the whole thing of you will surely die, you will not die thing.
I think I'll just broaden the scope just a little bit when it's talking about a murder from the beginning. We also have to keep in mind the Cain and Abel story. And
Yes.
that's
Yes.
where, because First John also brings in the idea of Cain being of the evil one, and that's why he murdered his brother. And so there's a little bit of that in there too. I
Yes.
honestly, I would just say that it probably just encompasses the whole idea. I like Genesis 3 because virtually every deception, and as I argue in my book, the foundation of all of Satan's works is deception.
Right.
Everything else is built off of that. And what we see in Genesis 3 are kind of like the basics of understanding how does demonic deception work. Well, it questions the goodness of God. It makes you feel like you're left out, that there's hidden and forbidden wisdom that you must need. It changes the possible consequences that you would receive for breaking the law, and there's all these lies about you won't certainly die. And we see that, of course, when we just walk by a Hindu temple.
Hmm.
So, I mean, there's very clear teaching in that, just that first few chapters of like, oh, that's how he works. And ever since then, he's just been repackaging.
Hmm. That's really well
And
said. Yeah.
and uh, and that's why I find it so important, like to kind of focus on the activities and then let people begin to see it and contextualize it in their local area, because all these activities are taking place in every single one of the cultures that we live in. The
Yeah.
question is, how is it happening and how has it been packaged or adapted into our cultural understanding?
Yeah. So for anybody watching this, every move away from truth is in a sense then like satanic, demonic in its
Mhm.
origins. Now, you know, we don't we can't see how all the strings are attached and exactly, like what's floating around in what room and how close that is to your body and your brain and all that kind of stuff. We don't need to. All right. Like that's what I appreciate about your book is it's like, let's focus on what is revealed and
Yeah.
then like take serious action. And, thinking of it's funny because that spiritual warfare section of my Bible memory thing, it's like, oh, I think if I don't draw a line somewhere, it will become the whole Bible. It's like, because it really, at some point, it really does just spill over. Like the whole project of Satan is to destroy the project of God, and we are his project. And he
Yeah.
is murdering us through every little deception, every little click that happens on the internet.
We're feeding into his systems, the world system.
Well, let me go to like a very obscure passage here, okay? And well, there's two.
Let's do it.
There's two, and because so one is First Thessalonians 2:18,
Hmm.
um, and you have here Paul saying to the Thessalonians, "We wanted to come to you, certainly I, Paul, did again
Hmm.
and again, but Satan blocked our way."
Yeah.
And then there's an almost even more obscure passage that feels similar. Um, Romans 15:22. So at the end
Yeah.
of Romans, well, it's kind of like getting towards the end of Romans 15 here, where Paul talks about wanting to preach on in places where there's no
Mhm.
foundation. He wants to do like apostolic missions work among an unreached area of the world. And he then ties it into this Old Testament passage in Isaiah. Those who were not told about him will see. Those who have not heard will understand. And then this is so interesting to me. Like I've got it highlighted here. This is why I have often been hindered from coming to you.
Yes.
Okay, wait. Like as like like a modern reader, I'm like
Yeah.
I I missed the why in there, and like
Yeah.
who's hindering you and why.
Yeah.
Anywhere you see the project and the mission of God, then that's where you actually should expect the satanic resistance, even in practical things. Like, I mean, I don't know
Yes.
exactly what happened. I mean, if it was modern day, it would be like, hey, my car didn't start, kind of a thing. I was like hindered from getting to, Toronto or Dallas or whatever.
And we can't always identify, as Paul does in First Thessalonians, that, these logistical problems are spiritual warfare. I know some Christians that literally anything
Yeah.
goes wrong with their car, they blame it on a demon or something. Okay.
Right.
But that doesn't seem to be the issue, because we
Yeah.
have to we have to keep in mind that, things can happen in the world around us and we will just not get an explanation.
Yeah.
Job did not know that Satan was involved. He just said the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. And that's many times what we have to deal with when we deal with logistical issues.
Right.
But I think the First Thessalonians 2 text is really helpful, because if you've been in missions, you just have some of the things that you want to do, that you've been longing to do, you believe the Lord has commanded you to do in Scripture. For some reason, it just never gets done.
Yeah.
and and obviously sometimes there's like fleshly reasons or world system reasons, but then there's just other times it just seems like there's just a hindrance there that you can't really deal with. And obviously we should pray about that, but I've been working on another book on the more practical side of how do we resist demons,
Mm.
and kind of identifying where they're at work. And one of my little sections is on seeing logistics as a form of spiritual warfare.
So, I mean, I love that question because I'm the person who can be sort of cynical and skeptical when people just sort of, hey, you took like,
Yeah,
you rolled a five on the Monopoly board and you just moved the piece like 10 pieces. It's like,
yeah,
wait, how did you get all the way to free
yeah.
parking? Like that, you skipped some steps. But
Mhm.
what I kind of came away as I've been meditating on this topic, again, because of your book, is the tighter your life is with the mission of God,
Yeah.
it's a smaller jump to say, yeah, like if my car doesn't start because I wanted to go to the baseball game, and then I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, Satan is blocking my way.
You know,
You know what I mean? It's like,
yeah.
that is a huge jump. And looking at how prayer works for Jesus, that it's like, hey, if basically you are aligned with my will and my
Mhm.
words abide in you, then start asking things, because
Yes.
now there's like power in this. It's not a
Yeah.
lucky, charm that you're rubbing to make your little life purposes work out. I think that same sort of like thing works in reverse, where when you are on a path of, it's kind of a screw tape letter sort of thing.
And this comes up a lot when it comes to just people's preoccupation with inhabitation and exorcism in local churches. There's a reason why exorcism is not commonly discussed in the letters, is
Hmm.
because it's supposed to be a part of mission.
Yes.
Um,
I think, what is it,
ex-
Act 16 or 17 that you point that out
yeah,
in the book?
I point that out in Acts 16. That's an extension of mission. Um,
Yes.
and in fact, all throughout, there's a reason why exorcisms are described in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts. Okay. And it's because those are the most missional books of the New Testament.
Mm.
And when they went, they preaching the gospel of the kingdom, there will be opposition. Did it mean that they should just stay home? No, it meant that they should trust the Lord and he would grant them victory.
So for those who are watching or listening to this, in Acts 16, Paul and Silas, I believe, are rolling into Philippi. And I mean, there's so much cool stuff that happens here. But one of the things that Scott points out in his book, and it's kind of just sitting on the surface there, but you do need somebody to point it out to you, is that where does it say that they were there
Further down.
for several days? We stayed,
Yeah.
yeah, for several days, and they were preaching and they were doing this ministry. So there was a female slave who had a spirit, and she was able to predict the future, and that was a kind of like an ATM machine for like whoever had control of that slave. It was like, oh, this slave can,
That is
in
also a
cash.
religiously tied word. Like they called her, Luke calls her that she has a puthon,
Yeah, it's
which
a very
is
weird
coming.
word.
Yeah, it's unique in scripture, but it's rather important because the Python spirit was the way in which was the power by which the Delphic oracle in Delphi would do her grand proclamations and predictions.
Okay.
And so this was kind of like the local knockoff version. And by opposing her, it would make him very much a stench in their local culture. And so he makes some strategic missional decisions here.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I mean, and first of all, like the NIV does not even have it, just like totally punts on the Python word. It's like not even in the text. It's like I like the NIV a
Yeah,
lot, but it's like that they just they just can't translate
yeah.
that.
So I go into depth on this on a recent Themelius article that I wrote on this text. And what's interesting here is that the girl is by the Spirit is saying these men are servants of the Most High God, which is interesting because in that time and place there were actually hymns to the Most High God, but it was to Zeus. Um, and uh, and then she says, "Who are telling you the way to be saved?" No, there's no definite article there. So it could be rendered as "Who are telling you a way to be saved."
hmm
And so what it seems to be is that this local spirit is deciding, well, let's just try to just kind of like fold these guys into the local polytheistic context. And so Paul
Yeah.
is kind of facing a difficult issue here. One is if he immediately opposes this girl, then he's going to get shut up by the local culture. There's going to be an instant hostile reaction to him coming in and dealing with it. Um, and then on top of that, there's the other issue of if I just let this girl go on forever and ever and ever, I'm going to get associated with
Yeah.
her. And if anyone comes to faith, they're going to accept her and me as
Yeah.
representatives of God's.
It's a syncretism question, right? Of
Yeah,
like that, like
absolutely.
it's like, hey, let's muddle this. And I think that's
Hmm.
a great word for like practicing missiologists and just practicing missionaries that
Hmm.
this is an interesting text to sort of mine for, hey, you could, Paul was on the verge of a movement, you know what I mean? And he doesn't want the movement if the movement is going to be syncretistic and not produce a pure community.
So he splits the difference. He tolerates her for a significant period of time, but eventually he gets annoyed and he just deals with it and then receives the consequences.
Yeah, it says
And I don't think he was oblivious to what would happen to him when he did this.
yeah, so when he does that, that's basically kicking the hornet nest
Yep.
and all, and then like then you have really this amazing scene with the Philippian jailer and all of that. But that's just, a great script for the whole thing's a great script. I mean, signs and wonders are part of displaying the gospel, and I think what you're saying is especially in an apostolic sort of missional space, not in a
Yeah.
hey, we're coming to church because we come to church, every Sunday. Everybody here wants to see some laser light stuff,
Yeah.
at church,
There will be miracles on the sign. That one gets me.
uh, yeah,
Uh,
totally.
and this is where we have to kind of say that, you know what? If we follow the Lord on mission, and we go where he wants us to go and we do what he wants us to do, we can trust that sometimes he'll do something unusual,
Hmm.
but we can't just call it into being.
Right. Right.
and and I think that's a bit of what God's doing here is that, you know, Paul has successfully done that initial burst of seed sowing, of sharing the gospel. You've got your first converts, but at some point he has to ensure that the gospel remains pure. And so all that happens here in short order. And the Lord decides, you know what? You're doing exactly what I want you to do, right where I want you to be. Let's deal with this little prison cell too.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That's so great. And I want to go to a totally different kind of lane here and get your thoughts. Luke
Yeah.
13:16 is a passage you deal with. Um, and what's, there's obviously it's thematic in the and like you said, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then and also in Acts that Christ is an exorcist, Christ is a healer of people. And you just see so many different stories. Are those two different things, exorcisms and healings, or are those overlapping, or are
Mhm.
those sometimes overlapping?
In this text, if you go up to verse 10, you see that he's teaching in a synagogue. Okay. It's again on the Sabbath because Jesus does the coolest stuff on Sabbath. And
Yeah.
behold, there was a woman who had a disabling spirit for 18 years. Now, that's the tricky thing because some people are like, well, what do you mean by that? Spirit is a very flexible word, both in Greek and in Hebrew and in English. I mean,
Mhm.
so there is significant conversation about this. And he sees her, he called her over and said to her, Woman, you are freed from your disability. That is not an exorcism formula that he
Mhm.
uses. Okay. Normally he dismisses a spirit, he tells it to go out, etc. It's not what he does here. He laid his hand on her, and immediately she was made straight, and she glorified God. Now, what's interesting about this, you get down to the end, and it says in verse 16, ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day?
Mhm.
And so it doesn't appear to be an exorcism, but at the same time, it seems to be tying in her physical affliction with Satan's work. Now, I don't think that this text is saying that every physical affliction, every back that has arthritis,
Right.
guilty,
Yeah.
is because of a demon or that we're bound by Satan in some sense.
Mm.
But there is a sense in which Satan and the enemy and his host can do things that would physically afflict.
Mhm.
Um, and so it's definitely one of those interesting stories that, especially for Westerners, this is really difficult because a lot of times we have this idea a natural a natural symptom must have a natural cause,
Mhm.
or a spiritual symptom must have a spiritual cause. But in this text, we're just seeing it all like this.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
and and so in spiritual warfare, we don't necessarily want to create one-to-one lines. We can say that the world is actually a, a complex intermix of
Yeah.
spiritual and physical causes that lead to excuse me, that lead to spiritual and physical consequences.
Yeah.
And that's where it just requires great discernment.
Yeah, and it's like, how certain can we be? Where, like, there's agnostic and there's certainty, and then there's like 100 places on the dial between that. Exactly, like, again, like the strings that are attached behind this, it's not that clear, but clearly there's strings attached.
Yep,
And so, and also I would just say clearly we don't need to understand exactly how the strings are attached, or it would be more clear to us.
exactly.
But at the same time, what I'm realizing is that as a Westerner, I have to see more strings attached than like. I need to move in the direction of my brother, Father Lalu, you know,
Yeah.
from Nigeria, or, and it's funny because there's their side of the room looking at us and our side of the room looking back. And that's the whole premise of this book, Demonology and the Global Church. But it's like, okay, I see these guys as being like, oftentimes my brothers and sisters who are making statements that maybe feel like too quickly, asserting a spiritual space. And I could kind of go, oh, they seem like they're way out on a limb there. But then it kind of dawned on me over since I read your book that it was like, I'm way out on a different limb. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I am
Yes.
way out on a naturalistic limb that is making a whole different set of assumptions. I
Hmm.
just live in a world that totally props that up, you know?
Hmm.
And so you don't feel the limb sort of like cracking and breaking. But
Well, and there's other things. I mean, you didn't grow up in a neighborhood where, as a child, you would watch the local diviner do rituals for the community.
right,
So, I mean, it's easier, I assume you probably you didn't go to someone to make sure that the spirits were pleased and give
right,
rain,
right,
for your
right,
crops that year. I
right.
mean, and
Totally.
so there's all those things that just aren't baked into you, that it's important to be listening to people from other contexts that have cultures that are much more overtly intertwined with spirits.
Okay, the fact that you brought up rain, I have to bring up my memory verse 14. At the end of Jeremiah 14, though, it's not explicitly talking about demons at all. It's talking about
Yeah.
God, what he does. But it's such a great like slap in the face to the naturalist worldview, or it exposes it. Do any of the worthless idols of the nations bring rain?
Mhm.
And then this is the line that's like, oh man, do the skies themselves send down showers? And then it says, no, it is you, Lord our God. Therefore,
Mhm.
our hope is in you, for you are the one who does all this.
Yes.
So this is obviously like way pre-enlightenment, you know, way pre-scientific age, you know.
Yep.
Or it's like it's not possible for me to know what it would have felt like to not understand how water turns to vapor and how clouds form and how, meteorology works. And so I think there's just an extra challenge because when I read that second line of do the skies themselves send down showers, I would be like, yep, they sure do. You know, in fact, the Chinese will send rockets up in the air and like shoot dust in the air and seed this, make it
Yeah.
rain. It's just like there are things we have been able to manipulate in the world.
But this is where we have to, I mean, we accept the doctrine of providence, don't we? That there can be more than one intention in any particular act, that God can superintend his intentions upon the free actions of others.
Right,
In the story of Joseph, even, okay? I mean, you get the chapter 50, verse 20, and he says, what you have intended for evil, God is intended for good. And you're just like, I get you, but I just had to live through like some 8 really difficult chapters, Joseph.
exactly.
and and we have to live with the same reality when it comes to people worshiping false gods. And when it comes to the work of demons in the world around us, that somehow, even as people might pray to a spirit to grant them rain, or we might view like just the rain comes down by itself, that somehow it's because of God's omnipresence and his life-giving nature that ultimately it comes from him.
Yeah.
And we can say that all those things can be involved, even as we would say that God is the one who ultimately sends the rain.
There's more complexity to how God works. And
Yes.
and how do we hold that and see a thunderstorm in a way that gives us that sort of awe of God still?
Mhm.
When we realize, and I think all this ties in thinking of the image of God itself in Genesis 1 being what comes under attack then in Genesis 3. And that really then, you can see how Satan is coming after that everywhere that God is coming back into building his image, whether it's in Israel, whatever, through the patriarchs in Israel, in the church, Satan is going to meet right there to destroy. And even also in the human family. I mean, you see that in Genesis 3, where the human family is under attack. One of the
Well,
things.
it's a strategic strike as well,
Yes.
because unlike the angels, which are static in number, the humans are designed with the ability to procreate with lineages and ancestry and bloodlines. And when you strike a family, you strike a bloodline. Not in the sense people get really hung up on the idea of like generational curses and things like that. That's not what I'm saying. But in the sense that, you pollute
Yeah.
someone's family with sin, it just naturally carries down.
Yeah. I mean, it's nature and nurture from, I think, what we're learning from science. You know,
Yes.
like epigenetics is teaching us that our choices get, I mean, I don't know how solid that science is because I don't have time to stay up on that. But like,
Yeah.
like Time Magazine level awareness of what epigenetics is, you know, it's, this idea that like, hey, you might smoke cigarettes for in your 20s, quit, and then not have kids until you're in your mid 30s, and yet you
Mhm.
triggered certain genes and dispositions and even like desires and things that will be passed on genetically. Okay, that just collapsed, nature and nurture into one thing, I mean, or my, so I did want to just like look at one more back to the Luke passage in that whole question of, and just say like whatever is happening here that Satan is keeping her bound. The demons are Satan is doing this. He has agency, and yet it's
Mhm.
also happening at a molecular level in this woman's life. It's not a mirage of a problem.
This text often goes into conversations concerning like what's the relationship of demonic activity and like psychological symptoms. And because this is only just one step away from that. And this is what I try to remind people. Like, you have to stop trying to say that there's like a neat line between those things,
Right.
in the sense that if someone is harassed, inhabited by a spirit, it can lead to psychological issues. And then on the flip side, if someone has psychological problems naturally occurring, it would lead them more to be more vulnerable to demonic interference of some kind.
Yeah.
And so there's just a confluence of issues, and I think that's the gritty answer that no one really wants.
It's, the classical question is like, are we trichotomy or a dichotomy? You
Yeah.
know, and it's like, are we soul, spirit, and body, or are we simply like, is soul and spirit sort of one thing and body? Is it like basically material and immaterial? And the language that was handed to me to use for this was helpful, was the idea of a complex dichotomy that like
Mm.
we are immaterial and material, and those are like linked together. If I could go back and give myself one bit of advice in premarital counseling to myself, it would be eat protein for breakfast and don't eat
Yeah.
donuts and coffee, because the amount of just being a raging jerk that happened in those first few years of marriage that were all tied
Uh-huh.
into blood sugar crashes and
Yeah.
stuff, and it's like, well, what is that? I mean, clearly that's a reactive hypoglycemic type reaction, but what's coming out is that James 4 type stuff, and it's like, well, where does one begin and the other end?
It doesn't have to. That's the
Doesn't have
thing.
to.
Like,
Exactly.
when we think even about our own spiritual life and the way that we pray, like there's a reason why we still our body many times. We put it in particular postures. Is because we recognize that we're a whole person.
Yes.
And that's one of the reasons why recreation is going to happen the way it will.
Yeah.
Praise God.
Yeah.
We're going to be a whole person.
You're sounding like an Anglican now, man. We're gonna, kneel and cross ourselves and do all kinds of stuff.
Uh-huh.
um,
I do have a kneeler over here for that reason.
there you go. I highly recommend anybody that's watching this to pick up your book, and it's going to be, and just buckle up and look up every Bible verse that comes up and mark it in your Bible, whatever, and you're going to come out with a worldview that is not the same as when you started. And it just done nothing but good for me. It has not led me down the road of quackery. It has led me to, look at Ephesians 6, when it says we're warring against all these things, it doesn't say, therefore, here's some magic potions and some like, like incantations and some, superstitious things to do. It says, therefore, take up faith in the sword of the Spirit, in the gospel, and pray for one another, And so it shouldn't lead us to quackery, but to real reliance on the Holy Spirit. What a fantastic conversation we had with Scott. That was so challenging. Please support Eyes on the Bible by subscribing, liking, sharing, commenting. Share this with your church networks, your missions networks, with your friends, with your family, because opening your eyes to what is going on in the spiritual world is one of the best things you can do for people.